Good afternoon. I'm Kira Bailey, Assistant Professor in Psychology and Neuroscience and co-director of the COVID-19 course, along with Dr. Franchesca Nestor in Politics and Government. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 17th lecture in our series. Today we will learn from Dr. Franchesca V. Nestor and Dr. Vanessa M. Hildebrand. Dr. Nestor joined the Ohio Wesleyan University faculty in 2017. She earned a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and a BA, MA, and PhD in political science from West Virginia University. At OWU, Dr. Nestor teaches courses on American politics, including the American presidency, Congress and legislative process, equality in American politics, American public policy, political science research methods, and her new food politics and policy course. She coordinated OWU's Get Out the Vote efforts for the past 2 years and developed and teaches 2 courses for OWU's OWL Camp for gifted middle schoolers, Harry Potter Politics and Hamilton, an American musical meets real American government. A Truman Scholar, Dr. Nestor's research interests include Congress, racial and ethnic politics, and public policy. She is a co-author on the book Contemporary Regulatory Policy and has recently completed a database spanning 70 years with the racial demographics of over 20 standing committees in the U.S. House of Representatives. Dr. Hildebrand joined the Sociology and Anthropology Department of OWU in 2019. She earned an MA and PhD in Sociocultural Anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Hildebrand is a cultural and medical anthropologist who investigates the complexities involved in providing medical care for vulnerable populations, especially women and infants. Most of her research focuses on the frontline caregivers, most often midwives. Dr. Hildebrand has conducted ethnographic research in Indonesia for 20 years, focusing on the interactions between shaman midwives, biomedically trained midwives, mothers, and global health programs. She's published many scholarly journal articles, book chapters, and a co-written book based on this research. Her research has been funded by Fulbright, the National Science Foundation, private foundations, and a Mellon grant. Dr. Hildebrand has started a new research project investigating the high infant and maternal mortality rates in Ohio. She enjoys teaching students about the great power of anthropological tools for understanding humanity. As a reminder, you can use the chat function to ask questions throughout the presentation. I'll select questions for our panelists to answer at the end. You can also continue your discussions on the COVID-19 course Facebook group. And now, Reframing the Future, Policy Change and Cultural Adaptation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Hello, everyone. As you know, I'm co-coordinator of the course, and Dr. Hildebrand has been very, very active with our Meet the Profs discussion sessions. So we've so enjoyed watching our colleagues present to you over these last few weeks, and we're really excited that we get to contribute today. I'll be talking about policy change and Dr. Hildebrand about cultural adaptation. I wanted to briefly share with you kind of what political scientists do. First of all, I'm an Americanist, so that means that I study American government and American public policy. I'll be focusing more on the public policy side of things today. And political scientists, oftentimes I think people believe that we sit around and talk about current events and what's happening politically right now, which we do. We do a fair amount of that. But what we're more interested in terms of being political scientists is finding general theories and understanding what typically happens and learning how we might apply those generalities to specific situations. So for example, in my presidency class, we don't spend a lot of time talking about individual presidents and circumstances that they found themselves in necessarily. We might use them as examples, but I'm more interested in knowing how do presidents interact with other branches? How do presidents differ in their approach to foreign policy versus domestic policy? How do presidents approach their relationship with Congress? So on and so forth. So what I'll be talking about today is how we might generally understand policy change and how it applies to COVID-19. And when I say policy change, I mean landmark, huge policy change in this case. I'm not talking about what happens in the bureaucracy every day. So Every single day, there are agencies who are working on changing policy by changing regulations. That's very important, and the Trump administration has been very adept at using that tool of public policy, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about major policy change. And so the question is, these things that we've talked about for a very long time, such as improved healthcare policy access, such as universal daycare, a basic living income, these sorts of policy solutions that have been floating around for a very long time. Can a crisis like COVID-19 shake those loose and get them actually passed through Congress? That's what we're talking about. So in trying to understand that, I thought it would help first, my computer will cooperate, there we go, to understand some basic theories of policy change. So the first sort of historical thought about how policy change happens is that it happens gradually and it happens in an orderly way. So as a problem arises, solutions come to solve it. And actually, that's not what happens most of the time. Policymaking is not rational, it's infused with politics. And as issues become more polarized, that is, Democrats have a more liberal view and Republicans have a more conservative view, it becomes harder to compromise, which makes it take a longer time for policy solutions to be adopted. And as issues are more salient, that is, as more people are interested in a particular issue, it also becomes harder to come to an agreed upon solution to policy issues. So it's usually not the case that policy change of this magnitude is gradual or orderly. The only example I would share with you and what I study is food allergen labeling. So I would say that policy has been fairly gradual and orderly. So as people became aware that food allergies were a problem, there were policies adopted to make companies label their foods so that people knew what was in it. And as it's become clear that other foods need to be labeled, changes have been made to deal with that problem. That's been reasonably gradual and orderly. You'll note that food allergy policy is not super polarized. It's also not something that's highly salient to a lot of people. It affects a group of people, a minimum group of people who have food allergies. So the amount of policy change that is pursued in a gradual or orderly way is very, very minimal. So in fact, policy change, when it's big policy change, is often very sudden. It's not gradual, it's not orderly, it kind of comes out of nowhere. And there's a fellow named John Kingdon who came up with his policy streams theory to try and explain how this works. He says you have to have these three streams come together, go through a policy window, and that's when you can get large-scale policy change. He says you have to have the problem stream, that is whatever the issue is that you're dealing with, unite with the policy stream, that is whatever the solution is. And it has to happen at a time that politically is favorable. So what's the national mood? How do the House and Senate align? Who's the president and what's the president's party? Okay, all of these things have to align for change to occur. And you might see from that, that means that change is very unlikely. It's quite a miracle when it occurs, but when it does, it happens very suddenly. Another school of thought, which is the more modern present day school of thought, is Baumgartner and Jones's punctuated equilibrium. And they say, okay, John Kingdon, it's true that when policy change of this magnitude occurs, it can happen suddenly, but that doesn't explain the fact that in between those punctuations, we have stability, periods of stasis where the status quo remains. And those of you who know the natural sciences might recognize this term of punctuated equilibrium from evolutionary biology. So I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but the idea is that in evolution, there are steep punctuations of change that occur and then long periods where things stay the same. And that's exactly what they're talking about as applies to public policy. So as an example, food safety policy. The problems of food safety experts have warned about for many, many years. And often stability reigns, but we get punctuation where Congress adopts new and important policies that regulate how we keep food safe. So for example, around the turn of the 20th century, Upton Sinclair wrote the book, The Jungle, and part of it was about the conditions of the meatpacking industries in Chicago. People thought it was really gross, and so the circumstances became favorable to have the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. Relatedly, in 2009, there was a major outbreak of salmonella in peanut butter. Peanut butter is an American staple. Children eat peanut butter. When people get sick off of eating peanut butter, it's very upsetting. And so we got a punctuation and we got policy that held people more accountable for when those sorts of outbreaks occurred. So the question is, as applied to COVID-19, where are we going to be? As this continues and someday ends, will we be in the status quo just as we were before? Or will we see a period of policy punctuation where change is possible? So there are some factors for you to consider to understand where that might be and maybe make some predictions. So the first would be, what type of problem is it? Elaine C. Kmark gives us a framework of problem types. The first being, is it a public problem or is it a private problem? Clearly, it's a public problem. COVID-19 made that step very, very quickly. Other policies have not been so quick. So smoking, for example, now we see it as a public problem that is something government should do something about, rather than just a problem of an individual. If you think of something more modern day, you might consider sugar. So there are some local governments that are involved in the regulation of sugar and how much sugar people can have. And there's still a lot of people who think that that is, an individual problem, a private problem that the government should not be involved with. So COVID-19, public problem, that helps get policy change happening. The other two frameworks to consider in terms of the type of the problem is it a persistent problem that's been around for a very long time, or it is a new problem? So a new problem comes suddenly on the scene, and people are more willing in that kind of a context to adopt large-scale policy change quickly. A lot of times it's more about perception than reality here. My students and I in my public policy class often talk about, is there any such thing as a new problem? So if you thought of COVID-19 as part of a bigger problem, pandemics, well, it's not a new problem. It's a persistent problem. Experts have been warning about it for a very long time. There were steps, not enough, but there were steps taken to deal with pandemics that were ignored and dismantled by the current administration, which is most unfortunate. So we would be foolish to ignore that. On the other hand, if we think of it as just COVID-19, the perception of it, it just seemed to come from nowhere, came crashing in on us, at least to the larger public. And that could lay fertile ground for large-scale policy change. I provided a slide here that shows two folks looking at a graph, and they say, oh good, we're flattening the curve. This is from a few weeks ago. I'm not sure we are flattening the curve anymore. But in any case, they're thinking only about COVID-19, and lurking behind them is a much bigger curve, climate change. So climate change would be categorized as a persistent problem that we really have not taken large enough steps to deal with, even though experts have warned us about it for a very long time, and we're very much aware that it's a concern. When people are thinking long-term, when they're thinking in terms of the assessment of risk, when they are competing with other problems that they would rather deal with first, when people are ignorant of the science underlying a certain problem, they may not be willing to take the large enough steps until it hits them over the head as something really, really bad. Okay, so crisis and sudden or perceptions of sudden problems can help lead to large-scale policy change. Related to that, something that can make a change seem new, a problem seem new, is focusing events, okay? Focusing events are happenings, events that occur that make it so we cannot deny that this problem is something that we need to do something about and do something about quickly. Some examples in terms of terrorism, 9/11 could be seen as a focusing event. It's not as if we didn't know about terrorism before then, but it changed people's perception of the problem and caused a punctuation in terms of how we handle terrorism policy. I spoke earlier of food safety and the punctuations that occurred there. I was trying to think about focusing events with COVID-19. Was there one? Perhaps COVID-19 itself is a focusing event if we think more broadly in terms of pandemics. Or perhaps there are events within the outbreak of COVID-19 that we might categorize as focusing events. I thought of a couple. So on the left, there are folks in the Lombardy region of Italy out on their balconies during the shutdown there, which was much more stringent than ours. I think a lot of people started to sit up and take notice of COVID-19 when that happened. I think this partially reflects ethnocentrism. If it can happen in Italy, it can happen to us. I think that was a time when people paid attention or started to pay attention. On the right, I have the mass graves being dug in New York City. That was a prominent image that made the rounds in the news media. I did not include because I think it's an upsetting image, but another related to that is those refrigerated trailers that they put bodies in when the morgues were too full. I think all of these things combined led to people realizing this is a major issue. It's something that we need to address. And so focusing events like that can help propel sudden and large-scale policy change. Related to that, okay, when you have a focusing event, what happens is you increase the scope of conflict. An increased scope of conflict, that's a term from E.E. Schnatschneider, means that more people are involved and the limited parties that normally control the status quo aren't able to do so. So what I have here is an iron triangle. Okay, so that's sort of an antiquated idea in political science, the idea that a congressional committee, a bureaucratic agency, and a single interest group can determine the outcome of a public policy in a particular area. Today, we're very polarized. Political parties are going to be involved in any decision-making that is major. And interest groups are much more sorted. They're much more aligned than they used to be. And so you would have a collection of interests that we're dealing with this in addition to partisan politics and any kind of scope of conflict you were talking about. Nevertheless, part of what allows the status quo to continue is when you have a limited amount of policy players who have a vested interest in the status quo continuing, making the decisions about how a policy proceeds. When a crisis happens, a focusing event, that all breaks open. Suddenly, there are so many people worried and involved that they start calling the shots more directly and making demands of their policymakers. And that's critical in terms of getting large-scale policy change. And I wanted to add here that importantly, even if there aren't focusing events, you can increase the scope of conflict other ways. Protest is a very good way to increase the scope of conflict and bring attention to an issue, get more people involved in the outcomes. Daniel Gillian, his recent work shows that when you increase the amount of protest in an area, in that area, voter turnout persists for some time, and increased voter turnout persists. So clearly, you get more people involved by bringing attention through protest. When a focusing event aligns with protest, then you get even more opportunities for the scope of conflict to open up, more people to be involved, and make demands of the government. When that happens, framing becomes critical. Okay, when we start to have political elites talking to the public about what policy solutions we should pursue, when that happens, we see frames emerging. Framing means shared ideas around how we should understand a problem and the solutions we should take to solve it. So you might think of them as slogans. Sometimes in class, I help students understand this concept by referring to memes. And sometimes it's just which parts of a problem do we focus on and talk about when we discuss that problem. So in a non-COVID example, just healthcare policy, the discussion over whether we should have a government-run healthcare program. Oftentimes, the two opposing frames that you hear, on the one hand, you get people saying it's a human right for everyone to have access to healthcare without worrying about how much they're going to be charged for it because you can't control your sicknesses. On the other side, you have a conversation about, well, it's socialism. And you are getting between a doctor and a patient, and that is not appropriate. That's not where we want the government to be. Related to COVID, I think we've seen several frames emerge. One is public health perspective and also infused with morality, I think. So you should listen to scientists. My mask protects you, your mask protects me. Those sorts of discussions. On the other hand, an early frame you got was COVID-19 and the shutdown versus the economy, and we have to preserve the economy. The fellow here in Harrisburg that's holding this sign is sort of infusing that concept with a public health focus by saying, well, okay, COVID-19 might be bad, but we are pursuing a cure that is worse than the disease by shutting down because shutdown causes public health problems too. I will say that this is one area where I'm a little concerned. I don't think that there has been a good job helping people understand what is happening and what we should be doing. A few weeks ago, I want to say 2 weeks ago, the Surgeon General came out and said something that I wished people were saying more early on, which is, listen, if you wear a mask, we can have more freedom because you can go out and do some things because you have the mask on. And I think it was a little bit too little too late, not to blame the Surgeon General necessarily, but the overall administration's discussion on this has been very unclear and very convoluted. And I think has sent mixed messages to people. Deva Woodley tells us in her research that frames that are successful are those that are common sense. They resonate with us because they link our values with solutions and show us how our current solutions don't align with our values. So an example she gives in her research is from the marriage equality debate. And she says, you know, originally our conception of marriage was you marry someone to increase your socioeconomic status, right? At one time, that was how people saw marriage. And today, our conception of marriage is you marry the person you love the most. And once advocates of marriage equality focused on that, love is love is love is love is love, that was a very winning frame that over time, in combination with protest, in combination with legal challenges, convinced a great number of the population, this makes sense. So I would think that part of what would promote us toward a punctuation would be a frame like that, a common sense frame that helps us see how all of these problems that we're seeing because of COVID-19 are related to one another. Okay, and finally, another thing that we need to think about is election results. Elaine C.K. Mark tells us that election results by themselves are not enough. So if you don't have some of these other former ingredients, you won't get change because that won't give you the momentum, that won't give you the scope of conflict that you need to achieve change, even if the person who is in charge wants to pursue change. On the other hand, even if you had all those ingredients, the election results can still put the brakes on change really, really fast. Institutions often have ways of slowing down progress that might seem inevitable. The Senate has the filibuster. The president has the veto. So essentially what I'm saying to you right now is please vote in 2020. November, vote, because that's going to be the final piece of whether or not we see policy change or not after COVID-19. As these changes build upon one another, we start to see related changes emerging. So right now we're seeing a spillover effect in terms of race in this country. People of color were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. People of color were disproportionately having to go out as essential workers. And at the same time, people of color are disproportionately being killed in the streets by people who are serving the state. And that's a problem. And so those things coalesce and lead to a recognition that other policy change needs to be pursued. And as you can see, recognizing it, however, is very, very different from doing something about it. So we have a long way to go. Now, the question is, do I think that we're going to see large-scale policy change as a result of COVID-19? And the answer is, I don't know. There are some ingredients there that I think are very likely to lead to that. I'm a little concerned about framing. I'm a little concerned about the election. So we'll see. A bigger piece that Dr. Hildebrand is now going to talk about is culture. A prominent political scientist once referred to the culture thing. It's very, very important. It helps us understand why some policy solutions are more palatable in some countries than in others. In the US, we have a very individualistic culture, a culture that's very focused on rights. And that has led us to have a certain view on masks, for example. So I will turn it over to Dr. Hildebrand to help us understand cultural adaptation.
Thank you. Let me bring up my screen here. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Nestor, for a great presentation and a nice introduction to mine. I really like that, all your graphics, but the last graphic especially, it's really a nice segue because it gets at where I want to end my presentation too, actually. Today we're going to work on this. We have experienced so much disruption as a result of this pandemic, including a nearly full stop on our daily activities. How can we understand the social and cultural impact on our country, and what can we expect in the future? So this pandemic has indeed caused a great deal of change. A time of great vulnerability and separation has shown us the undeniable societal cracks in stark relief. And now it's time to come back together as a society and find some of those solutions in that last graphic. Laurie Anderson's talk at the beginning of this lecture series and many of the talks since, we don't want to go back to normal, we want to go back to better. But going back to better requires cultural change. And it all boils down to how we treat other people within our culture, in our community. So how can this be the era of dismantling structural racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination? How are we going to ensure that we're neither going back to normal, if that was even possible, or just collapse in apathy? So are we going through a period of great cultural change? I argue that yes, we are. A very rapid period of culture change. Culture is always changing, as I'll explain in a moment, but I think we're experiencing a moment, and I just learned from Dr. Nestor about the use of punctuated equilibrium and focusing in events that pair very nicely with this. Okay, so, and then I'll end with some suggestions about the strengths of our society that we can use to move from the collective representation and awareness about the grave problems in our society to hopefully some real change. But first I want to say a little something about what is anthropology, and I'm not going to go through all of this. I have a few more notes on my slides than I will actually say, so that if, especially for students going back, you can go back and find some details. So anthropology is a very wide field that investigates the emergence of Homo sapien and related primates over time and geography up to the contemporary era, and that's pretty broad. And anthropology provides a unique set of tools that help us understand our rapidly changing world and great diversity of humanity. We have 4 subdisciplines: archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and cultural anthropology. And I'm a cultural anthropologist. And this means that I study people's everyday lives and communities, behaviors, beliefs, and institutions. And we cultural anthropologists study everything from basket making in contemporary Navajo reservation to opioid use in Ohio, to migrant labor along the Mexico-US border, and the global production of luxury goods in developing countries. If there's a human doing it, there's an anthropologist studying it, basically. And we use some unique research methods that we share with sociology, which is one of the reasons why we cultural anthropologists are often paired with sociology in departments such as at OWU, it's called the SOAN department. And those are essentially ethnographic research methods. They're qualitative in nature. We do research over a very long period of time. And the goal is to learn the native's point of view we saw. And the native might be a farmer in Saskatchewan. It might be someone in New York City working in the gig economy. It might be a shaman midwife in Indonesia, or it could be a hedge fund manager in London. All of those people are just a native in their little community of focus. So let's talk a little bit about what is culture. For anthropologists and sociologists, culture is a technical term. So this is kind of like the word significant for a statistician. We all use the word, all us non-statistician use the word significant, but if you say that word to a statistician, they want a p-value because it means something. And for us, culture means something very specific. It means a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior that are shared and contested by a group of people. And culture shapes all of our norms, values, symbols, and worldview. And it also, importantly for what I'm talking about today, shapes structures of power and hierarchy. So culture is always changing, but we see sometimes when there are some of these events or things that we go through, we see more rapid change than we might normally see. And culture is also never homogeneous. It's held differently by all of the members within a society. Okay, so why do I think that there is culture change, rapid social change and culture change happening now? Simply put, culture shapes who a group of people think should be in power and what rights they have. Remember, power in society is agreed upon pact. And yes, that power is enacted by the powerful on the less powerful, but society members also have some agency. They have agency to participate in culture in different ways. So are the members of culture agreeing with those structures of power Or are they objecting and saying, that's not who we are, and erupting into protest? Ultimately, members of a society agree that members have certain rights and responsibilities. Who is it who society believes has full membership or not full membership? Also a key question right now. Who should be in power and why, and what types of punishments should be enacted if those rules are not followed? And if those rules are not followed, by whom? So this is a very messy process, but that's because humans are messy. What we're seeing right now is a wide-scale agreement across the country that many of our societal injustices are not acceptable. And those injustices are not new in any shape or form, but race-based killings and harassment have occurred since the beginning of our country. The low-wage workers that society depends on, yet simultaneously demonizes, is not a new phenomenon. But through this pandemic, we're able to see how important this portion of the population is to us and how unjust it is that certain populations of the country were at more risk than others. So cultures changed. There's wider agreement across the country that this is not okay. People don't take to the streets for days at a time until something's clicked. And politicians won't risk speaking out until they're sure that they'll have a majority of their constituents supporting them. So first we're going to talk about, just a moment, the slides up here, about how the pandemic is socially different and remarkable. Then how anthropologists think about culture change and why those modeled processes don't work very well for the pandemic. And then we will borrow the idea of a rite of passage to help us with a model that fits cultural change as a result of the pandemic. So this pandemic was different than other things we have, and you all know that, and we've all read it, and that's something that the media has covered a great deal. But this social isolation is something that, of course, anthropologists have really talked about, and everything stopped. No one knew what would happen. For example, Bob Gitter, in his talk a few weeks ago, he's an economist, and noted that all the economists were incorrect in their predictions about employment rates. What is normally up was down, and we didn't have any signposts, and we still don't have many signposts. The framework that guides the lives of US citizens just isn't working. And most of us in the US have never had a moment like this, but we've all been touched, and we've all cozied in a little as a result, and we've all cozied in a little in the way that we are as a society. Out came the signs in the yards to say thank you to those who risk their health to save others. All of a sudden, everyone realized how dependent they were on grocery workers. We became scared as we saw empty shelves in the grocery store, or how unfair the structures of inequality are, as people who made all this happen for became the most important workers at all. And we saw the importance of the teachers who are with our children every day as we tried to become those teachers. So let's talk about theories of social change a little bit. And these are actually more discussion of processes. And I like the way that our own Jim Peoples framed this in his textbook. So we look at this in terms of discovery. Culture change happens in discovery, innovation, and borrowing. And so I'll describe what they are very briefly, and then describe why it is that this actually doesn't explain the pandemic very well. And so we'll try something else. So discovery, that's when there's new cultural knowledge out there that, they independently discovered something in a member of society through observation, experimentation, or chance. And this helps us a little bit, but not completely, and not enough to understand why we're seeing this culture change now. Because there wasn't a discovery of any sort except for a novel virus. The pandemic revealed cracks, but the cracks were always there. So innovation. And this is when there are multiple elements of a cultural knowledge that are combined in a way so that something new is created. Well, nothing new has been created. Society has largely directed a blind eye to the fate of low-wage workers and the structures of racism. This is nothing new. And borrowing, this is when cultural knowledge is spread from members of one society to another. And this doesn't explain why we're seeing culture change now, as nothing has been borrowed. So we can understand, how can we understand the process of why society at large is more willing to see and less accepting of structural inequality? And why now are people across the nation willing to leave their daily routine and do resist and protest that most people find to be frightening? It takes a great deal to get people out in the streets. So many of the presentations in this lecture series have expertly and amply illustrated the way that the current pandemic created a time of vulnerability and how people dealt with this over time and how insidious these cracks are. So Ellen Arnold gave us this wonderful quote, and it was echoed by Karen Poremsky, Randy Quaid, Don Sebe, and Michelle Noble. So Ellen Arnold said, disaster unveils the way that things actually work instead of the ways that we think they work. And I think that looking at the ritual process that we've all gone through has helped us reemerge in the greater communal moment. So I'll walk you through the community building of ritual. So during the height of the social distancing, when everything was shut down except businesses deemed essential, I watched on the line and in the life of my own family, all the new rituals that emerge in everyday life. I thought about the importance of ritual in not only all people's lives, but as a builder of society and culture too. And this led me to think how we understand the movement of a person through the life course in society. Ritual embodies the belief, passions, and a sense of solidarity of a group of people. And rituals are beliefs enacted. And we see and feel our culture through rituals. So we learned from Emil Durkheim that ritual creates a sense of continuity and belonging and defines a group, and it regenerates itself, a group regenerates itself and grow. And I'm suggesting that surviving a pandemic has many of these same features as moving through a rite of passage. So a rite of passage is a type of ritual. And I think the explanation of how we as a society are moving through this pandemic experience than what we normally use to explain culture change. Rites of passage are rituals that mark intense changes in an individual's membership to society. And we tend to focus on the individual aspect of rites of passage, but really it's meant to look at how society builds its people and comes together. Okay, so ultimately rites of passage are about building culture in society, and they also mark change in society. So we usually talk about rites of passage as being something like birth or coming of age ceremonies or marriage or death. It's a period of time that a person or group of people goes through in a forever change. There's no way to not have that mark of the ritual process on the community. And once the ritual has happened, there's no going back. We're only borrowing this concept because it's problematic in some ways, but because an individual isn't society, a society is not embodied in totality in an individual, but this is a tool that we can use to help us think about this process. Okay, so the process of rituals and rites. So we think about the process as having three phases that will lead us to build communitas. So rites, so they have three steps: separation, liminality, and reaggregation. So separation, this is when the group, and think about this as we're going through this, about how this kind of emulates how we went through this first part of the pandemic. This is when a group becomes separated physically, psychologically, symbolically from the normal activities of daily life. Something has to happen to make that separation happen across a group. So we left our daily routines and had to figure out how to do something else. It meant all kinds of things. For some people, literally meant they had to find a new place to live. Now, liminality, this is a period of outsiderhood during which the ritual participant or participants are set aside from normal society. And this is a period of time where they're existing on the margins. And in a lot of ways, we were all existing on the margins. We were all separated and trying to figure it out on our own, and thinking about what it is we missed, what it is that we would go back to, what didn't we miss, and how would we come back together. So we're living without our normal support systems and routines and habits and supplies, but we had to figure it out. How to figure out how to get food into the house. Then we had re-aggregation. So this is the return of individuals or group to community living. And the individual group is forever transformed by this experience of liminality and endowed with a deeper sense of meaning, purpose, and connection to the larger group. And as they come back together, they're able to communicate this meaning to each other in ways that don't need to be spoken. We all know because we went through this. Our children whose school years were disrupted will all tell the tale when something happened, when school was canceled that previously was thought to be impossible. And they learned that most of them would prefer to be together in school, and they'll probably quite joyously return in August. This process fosters and creates communitas. So communitas, it means to achieve a greater sense of community, where we have a common identity and bond as a result of the shared experience. So now it's time to come back together as a society and find solutions to all those things that we saw and were upsetting. So we're not completely back because the coronavirus pandemic is not over and we don't know what's happened, but enough has happened to dislodge structures. Surviving this pandemic has many of the same features as moving through the rite of passage. And we haven't merged at the end, but we are in a new stage. And it's going through this pandemic that emulates the process in really striking ways. So how do we, as Laurie Anderson suggested, go back to better? Well, I won't suggest that I have any solutions at all, but I have some ideas about where to start. And we can be the era, how can we be the era of dismantling racism and sexism and the gaps between poor and rich, specifically healthcare for all of us? Going back to better requires that culture change. Going back to better boils down to how we treat people. And if we treat people better, we're going to treat the earth better too. How do we ensure that we neither go back to normal or just collapse into apathy? So I suggest in the next step is a little counterintuitive. And I suggest that we ask, instead of, we've really focused on what we're so bad at, for just a moment, we focus on what are we good at? Where are we great? What kind of tools do we have to fix the problems that we have? And I suggest that we have 4 really important strengths. The first of them is a strength of humans, and the other 3 are strengths of our society in general. But these strengths are also really big flashpoints and points of tension. In fact, much of what our inequalities are about these things. But we need to think of our strengths for just a moment. So first of all, humans are cooperative in nature. There are a lot of writers out there, none of them anthropologists, who say humans are by nature violent. And actually anthropologists will tell you that it's really not true. That we see for millions of years of our human ancestors and contemporary times that more often than not, we are cooperative in nature, and that we work together. And when we work together well, then that is our greatest chance at survival. 1.9 million years ago, we can see that Homo erectus assisted each other in childbirth. So number 2, we are diverse. And as you're already saying, Yeah, but that's part of what we're fighting over, and that's part of what racism and sexism and issues about gender identity equality and the like is about. But this has always been our greatest strength. Immigrants, gender identity, sexuality, racial and ethnic identity, cultures, worldviews. We're the most diverse nation in the world. And we have to remember that the minute that one type of person enters a room to solve a problem is the minute that that solution will work well. We have to have the multiple voices. So that's the big boss man method. And we know it doesn't work. So we need to go back to the stories that we tell, many of them fallacious, about, but it gives a sense of something that we do value, about joint problem solving across war borders, across disagreements. We see the ingenuity that all of our immigrant ancestors brought to this country. And we can just see that even in our unique cuisine and the mixture of cuisines that we see. So this is where we are best. Number 3, willingness to take the hard road. And what is right is often not easy, but throughout history, we can see that every time we made a decision for the better of our country and society, that was not easy, and it was often messy at first, but because it was the right thing, and if we kept at it with persistence, then it ended up really helping us. It took over 50 years to try getting something like the Affordable Care Act passed, and it wasn't perfect. It was messy. It still is messy. It was a hard road uphill both ways, but it was the right decision, and it is making a huge impact. And number 4, the willingness to deconstruct what doesn't work. And this is really the hardest, because with privilege, those with privilege are the last to ever agree with this. Those who benefit from a system don't want that system to be destroyed. But this is part of our history as a culture. We've changed course midway and said that we won't do this anymore. Labor laws, previous civil rights, suffrage, emancipation, none of them perfect, but willing to change course and deconstruct. So in order to, we have to tell the story of our nature of cooperative beings who gain through innovation and problem solving with their valued diversity, and who are willing to walk down the hard road to look for a better life. Anthropologists and sociologists generally aren't optimistic. We're professional critics of all power structure. But today I'm suggesting for a moment we take the doubting voice off of our shoulders and invite the constructive voice to help us through this societal rite of passage. So thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I want to start with a question that I think does a nice job of kind of combining some of what you both spoke about. So many people have talked about the new respect that people have gained for essential workers and teachers because of what's happened with the pandemic. Do you think that this mindset is going to stick once things move to a new normal and help maybe change policy around things like salary, as well as changing culture around things like our respect for those professions?
Mm-hmm.
I can speak to the policy piece. This is an exciting question to me because, and my students know I can't get through any conversation without mentioning them from West Virginia. So here we go, COVID-19 course. I'm from West Virginia. In recent years, we had a lot of advocacy activity among teachers in West Virginia. They organized and they have fought for change and still want more change. And so I think in combination, so there's a couple of things. One is the events themselves make us realize the importance of essential workers and teachers. Parents were having to step into that role and not finding it much to their liking. But we also have ready groups to protest and advocate for themselves. So we saw some of the delivery services ready to protest and advocate for themselves. I think we have a long way to go. But in terms of some ingredients that we would look to, to have policy change. I think that it's possible, and I think it's more favorable than it has been in any other time.
I immediately went back to that wonderful graphic that I keep mentioning of Dr. Nestor's at the end of her presentation, and this is actually really one of my great concerns, is that, you know, as we get back to schedules and busyness and not being in so much shock, that that there be just we'll forget and go back to and not remember how all the things that we learn. And but the other option is kind of to become complacent and feel a little apathetic, that this is too hard and too big. And somehow I think that we have to not allow ourselves to be taken over by those feelings of it's too hard, it's too big, and it's too awful, and just be relentlessly optimistic and think about the way what could be. And so that's really why I wanted to kind of focus on like how are we great, and how is this different from where we are, and not lose sight of that. And so we that's why I really think we have to think about what is it that we do well, and how can we be more like that, and less like all these problems. So and I think Dr. Nestor's call for energy around this next election is really critical, because this is the biggie that, you know, every 4 years, and this is a chance there's so much energy around it. And so I really hope that this is a moment for our teenagers, and especially our newest voters, to learn how exciting it is to be part of that process. And so as much energy as we can muster for the next, this coming fall in the election, I think is really important.
Thank you. And actually something that you said, Dr. Hildebrand, leads me to the next question, which is that a few people have noted that getting back to better may be somewhat of an uphill battle, because we have to convince some people who want to go back to normal that normal was unacceptable.
Yeah.
So do you all think that we can succeed in not forgetting the lessons of COVID, and how can we make sure that we don't forget?
I'm a little worried, because I think that some people have already forgotten the lessons of COVID at this point. On the other hand, I'm heartened by the fact that it would be ignorant to say that this isn't a partisan issue to some degree, right? We see different reactions from people who are Republicans and Democrats in terms of how they behave. But I think it's less partisan than other issues have been recently. So we saw, for example, this weekend, fewer people in Oklahoma turned out than expected at President Trump's rally. And while it may have been teenagers that were buying up the tickets, it also appears to be the case that people were just legitimately concerned about coming to an event like that during a pandemic. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. And I think the other factor is going to be, again, what happens in 2020, the election. And I would say, I would add to what we've been saying, keep your energy, go out and vote. Make yourself aware of the ways in which there are barriers that are constructed to voting, and giving access to folks who are the most likely to have a voice about how things should change. So yes, I'll end it there.
This is a real issue of concern, and I think the only way that we can keep this in our memory is by continuing to talk about it, and really focusing on the issue. And you know, I think the questions that you know, there is lots of diversity in the way that people think about the risk involved, and where we're going to go, and like the photo that Dr. Nestor had in her presentation, that the cure is worse than COVID. I don't remember the phrase. I mean, there is a variety of opinions, but we know that about society. And so the key, I think, is just to keep that dialogue going and be mindful of the narrative that we project, the words that we use, and continually work on possibility. Because generally we see that people are more motivated when they see a goal that feels reachable. So also think about smaller, smaller steps. You know, the old adage about what's the way to eat an elephant, and it's one bite at a time. And to just think about what some of those bites can be. And I think the extent to which we're all taking bites and remembering this is really important.
Thank you. And I think that the election has come up several times now, and voting. And so someone's asked, what's going to happen if people are deprived of easy ways to vote and have to work really hard to get their ballot because of things like voter suppression?
Well, it won't be good. And it's of the things that I am concerned about right now, that is right at the top of the list, because I've seen in normal times how that happens, how it happens to college students, and it's going to be bigger. We saw either a statement or a tweet or both from President Trump today, him saying that foreign governments are going to flood our mail with fraudulent ballots. Mail-in voting, that's old news. That's been around for a really, really long time, and Republicans and Democrats have trusted it, and in many cases, it has led to a greater vote share for Republicans in many places than for Democrats. So I don't have any good answers in terms of what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen in terms of the outcome, but we need to see action on this. And if you want to learn more about it, I would recommend Stacey Abrams is the leading expert on voter suppression. She has a really great Brookings Institution talk that's like 10 minutes, 15 minutes about the different ways that this happens. She provides really specific examples. And she also has a book that's coming out. So she's been making the rounds during interviews recently. So I would say educate yourself about this. Maybe be part of getting the word out about how people should access their absentee ballots. I wouldn't necessarily recommend being a poll worker during a pandemic, but for those who are low risk and feel that they have places where they can be safe, that would be another really important thing to do, and be trained in the ways that voter suppression can occur at your location.
I don't have all that much to add there, except for I share that concern. I mean, that it's one of our you know, we talk about, if you've listened to the way that Americans talk about other countries when they're speaking in critical terms, one of the first things that will come up, one of the first critiques of many other places, is they don't even have fair elections, and we need to think about you know, that's one of the critical things that we need to do. So I've been thinking about, you know, I teach on voting day, and I don't quite know what I want to do about that to encourage voting. I think a lot of the students will be doing mail-in votes, but you know, I can't give extra credit for going to vote, but I would if I could.
I kind of love that idea, Dr. Hildebrand. Maybe we should look into it, a whole OWU policy of giving people credit for voting. All right, so I want to thank you both, Dr. Nestor and Dr. Hildebrand, for being with us today and sharing your time and knowledge. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us and asked excellent questions. We had a few more that we don't quite have time to get to, but I want to tell you again that you can join the conversations on the Facebook group. And another way to continue these conversations is the Meet the Prof sessions. So the students who've registered for course credit can join us tomorrow, or sorry, not tomorrow, join us on Thursday at 4 p.m. in Blackboard Collaborate. And the community members can join us at noon on Friday. The RSVP links will be sent later this week in an email, but you can always contact COVID Course Coordinator at owu.edu if you have any questions. We will see you all again on Wednesday at 4 p.m. for When Will It Be Safe to Go Out Again? Challenges in Vaccine Development and Why It May Be Okay Without One, with Dr. Seren Ambigalkar. So I'll see you all then.